Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Monoxide Podcast. I'm your host, Harris, a.k.a. Monoxide, man of many automotive aspirations, and I am here with my co-host, Dan, Mr. Gunna Garage.
It's me.
This is the only intro we filmed. I promise this whole trip I've not been doing more than 3 intros.
Yeah.
And today we are here with Ben Kaminsky, General Manager of SEMA Garage, and also formerly involved with General Motors and Bosch. So I reached out to you because it was actually a recommendation from Mirza. He's like, hey, you should reach out to this guy. I used to, work somewhat alongside him back in the day. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, a little bit about SEMA Garage, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, sounds good. Well, first of all, thanks for coming. We're happy to have you here. So we're actually sitting in the installation center in the SEMA Garage, Detroit. And we actually have 2 locations in the U.S. So one is in Diamond Bar, California, which is just east of Los Angeles, and then here in Detroit and Plymouth, Michigan, in the SEMA Garage, Detroit. So, so I kind of came into this job. I've been a performance enthusiast my entire life. I grew up on a farm in Indiana and loved anything with wheels, pretty much. And then I got into my teenage years, and I didn't have a mullet, but I did have an IROC. So I was, and that was kind of where I first kind of got my love of the automotive stuff. Was I started working on that car a lot and rebuilt the engine in it, and actually grew up about 10 minutes from John Lingenfelter's original shop in Decatur, Indiana. So I knew John. I worked with John on actually some of my college projects, and some of the folks, Graham Behan at the time at Lingenfelter Performance Engineering there. And anyway, then I went to college, so I'm a mechanical engineer by trade. So I went to Cedarville University, and I worked on an ethanol vehicle program. So basically it was put on by the Department of Energy and General Motors. That was kind of where I brushed with General Motors the first time. And we did a twin-turbo Silverado, which at the time it ran door-to-door with a Corvette in the quarter mile on E85. And so that was when if you remember when the 5.3 kind of first came out, like right around the 2000 time frame. So,
yeah.
And then from there, I went to Honda Research and Development in Marysville, Ohio, actually Raymond, Ohio, and did emissions testing work in the engine research department there. And that's kind of where I cut my teeth on emissions work. So, and then from Honda, I went to APR, a small aftermarket company in Alabama that maybe the folks in the Volkswagen Audi community know pretty well.
It's pretty sizable nowadays, too.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. And they're actually one of our SEMA members, by the way.
Okay.
So that's kind of where that ties together. And then from there, I learned a lot about the Bosch engine control unit. And so then I actually moved back to Michigan and came to Bosch and did some quality things, but most notably worked in the motorsport department and ran the hardware department at Bosch Motorsport in North America for a number of years. And then from there, I went to Chevrolet Performance and did performance parts release. And that's where I bumped into Mirza, where he was doing kind of more on the performance vehicle development side. I was doing more performance parts. And then this opportunity came up to be able to run this garage. And the love of the aftermarket and trying to help the aftermarket and my love of performance parts and all things performance, this seemed like a great opportunity for me. So I came in. My first 18 months were a crash course in construction management. So the facility that you're sitting in was basically an empty shell of a warehouse when I started. And so we basically designed it and built it out and construction managed it all the way through till about 2 years ago when we had our grand opening. Since then, we've been doing emissions testing and all the various programs in product development and vehicle technology that we have today. So,
which, by the way, this facility is freaking immaculate. Like, you could eat off this floor. I've never seen a shop this clean in my life.
I wouldn't even call it a shop. It's like a lab. It's not. Yeah, it's crazy here.
Well, you mentioned lab. We do have to keep basically a lab grade cleanliness to be able to do the testing that we do here for emissions, right? So, so you're spot on with that. And sometimes I do eat off the floor. Actually, Jet's Pizza is typically what I prefer.
Yeah. We just had that for the first time on this trip, ironically, before we even got here.
Is that right?
Yeah,
we
in
had it in
Chicago, actually.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Which is really funny. We just did a little pop-up at our friend's dealership or whatever. It was, first time trying Jets. It was good. But no, I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, you're showing us the caliber of stuff. So last year I had Nick Colaroso on the... hope I said that right, on the podcast at SEMA, and he was discussing about how SEMA drives values for its members, and he mentioned SEMA Garage, and now seeing this, it's like, especially the amount of money that's invested in this facility and the type of equipment that you showed us around, I mean, it's kind of crazy what you provide value-wise to members. So you were kind of explaining what's the purpose of being a member and what do they get out of it. Do you want to kind of touch on that and explain how a member would use a facility like this?
Yeah, sure. So basically the pass in the door is your SEMA manufacturer membership. So we have SEMA individual memberships, which is now known as SEMA Plus, and we also have SEMA member manufacturers. So this garage is really designed for those businesses who are selling into the aftermarket to utilize for product development, specifically automotive product development. So, and we do that in a number of different ways. We do that with our emissions testing and compliance program. We do that through our development department, which means like things like 3D printing, 3D scanning, access to CAD data from General Motors and Ford in our database, and then our vehicle technology department, which is primarily consisting right now of our ADAS technology research center and testing. So ADAS being Advanced Driver Assistance System. So where we bring to the value to the members is if they are looking to develop a product, we can come alongside them and help with some of the maybe more expensive or more difficult processes or that you typically would encounter in product development.
Such as?
So for example, emissions testing. So let's say that you have an air intake that you want to develop for the GTI that you drove in the door, right? So we could come alongside and maybe you have all the technical understanding on how to make the best, lowest restriction, coldest air intake in the industry, but now all of a sudden you want to make it legal to be able to sell in California. Well, how do you do that outside of hiring a team of lawyers and spending 6 years to understand the process? You can actually come into the SEMA Garage and drop the part off on our doorstep, and we can basically take that part and file all the paperwork that you need, work on all the paperwork that you need, identify the testing that you would need, get a vehicle for you that you would need to do the testing, do the emissions testing, take all the data, put it into the appropriate documents that we would need to turn into the California Air Resources Board to get kind of the Hippocratic oath of the aftermarket for emissions, which is a CARB executive order, project manage it all the way through to the end and deliver you an executive order that you can put in the box and then sell that product. So we can do all that soup to nuts. So you can do what you do well, which is develop an amazing air intake that does everything that everybody wants it to do, and not have to, and then basically take the burden of the compliance and all the testing and things that need to go along with that to be compliant. So you don't get an unfriendly knock in the middle of the night from a 3-letter agency, wanting to see, your emissions testing. You've already got that all buttoned up.
Who provides the vehicle in a testing situation like that?
Yeah, so good question.
Yep.
There are basically 3 ways that we come about vehicles. So one is if we see a need where there are members who are wanting a certain vehicle, like we talked about off camera, but we have a Duramax diesel pickup that we have a lot of products lined up for. So we actually went out and purchased that, and we basically let the members use that truck to do that emissions development on. And in fact, in that truck, we actually emissions tested it prior to buying it to make sure that the emissions looked good before we actually went out and purchased it. So that's one way, is we actually purchase them. The second way is we actually have a partnership with National and Enterprise Rent-A-Car, and they actually allow us to rent cars for use with emissions testing. So we can actually go out and rent a vehicle for a member and actually bring it in and then install the parts on the vehicle or the tune or whatever they want to test, and then actually go test it.
That aftermarket for white convertible V6 Camaros must be crazy then, huh?
Yeah, it's one of the hottest, if I do say so myself. And then the third way that we get vehicles is that the SEMA member themselves may have the vehicle that they've been doing development testing on, or maybe they have the new vehicle that they actually can provide to us and do the emissions testing on that. So those are the 3 basic ways that we get vehicles currently to be able to test for our members.
Okay. How does that look for... So are they also, I bring in my cold air intake now that I've just developed and I want you to do that. Is that included in my membership, or is that something now I also pay you for your time in that situation? Yeah,
great question. So so those sort of services that are kind of, I guess I would consider to be add-on services, we do charge the members actually for those. Although I will say, so SEMA and SEMA Garage is a nonprofit organization. So we're just looking to cover our costs. So typically the costs that we have are very cost competitive in the market, because we're not looking as a for-profit business. We're working as a nonprofit business, really driving the value to the members. So we kind of look at it like a wheel. We want our SEMA members to go to the SEMA show, right, and develop and get their products sold to the buyers. But in order to do that, we kind of step in and help them develop that product, right? And it kind of round and round the wheel goes, right? So we help develop product, take the product to SEMA show, they sell that product, and they move on to the next product. We help them develop that product, go to the SEMA show. So it's just kind of this, they feed off of each other, I guess you could say. So, but a lot of some of the services that we have, like if you, as a SEMA member, if you want to come in and actually use the installation center that we're sitting in now, you can do that free of charge. You can come in and use the tools. You can come in and use the space, and you can do that free of charge. But if you want to do emissions testing, for example, we can get folks a quote on what, and what the particular testing that they need to do is. And that can range. It depends. Some of it's can be very, I would say, unintrusive, where you're kind of doing just a verification to make sure that the OBD and emissions readiness monitors are set in the vehicle, and you don't actually have to do tailpipe emissions testing, up through and including a complete emissions tailpipe testing procedure and program where you really have to go through all of it. And it kind of depends on the product. If you're doing something simple, a quick change to a vehicle, then it can be very light. But if you're doing something big like a turbocharger or a supercharger on a naturally aspirated engine, then you're signing yourself up for a good bit more testing.
Okay.
So I definitely want to get into emissions here at some point, but I do have a quick question. Can you paint a picture of just how big the automotive aftermarket is? I don't think most people have an understanding of just how much is out there.
Yeah, great question. In fact, we did a study on that recently to understand the economic impact in the United States. And just part sales is approaching $55 billion in just part sales. But that it doesn't stop there, right? That's just, honestly, that's kind of the beginning. Where we ended up is the economic impact is $338 billion a year in the United States. So that's a big number.
Billion with a B.
With a B, yes. B is in Bravo. And so that's a big number. It's not just some closet in the corner industry, right? You think about what goes into the performance aftermarket. It may be shipping at UPS. It may be the diesel that goes into the UPS truck. It may be the person who works in the front office who is doing the billing. It may be a tax accountant that's doing the taxes of that business that is selling those performance parts. So, and
even the businesses that are probably installing it, I'm guessing you probably took that into account?
Exactly. Yeah, all of those things that all of the chain down the line, right, from the business to the consumer is $338 billion. So, and what we've done actually with our government affairs department is now we're actually starting to kind of flex our muscles in Washington, D.C. and say, hey, when you guys are writing these laws and you're looking at writing this stuff, we want to be a part of that, and we want to understand how that's going to impact our industry. And if it is negatively impacting our industry, we'd like to work with them to try to come to a more sustainable solution for our industry. Because what we don't want is for the aftermarket industry, or even a portion of it, to be written out of existence in Washington, D.C. with the stroke of a pen.
Well, the government seems like such a reasonable bunch of people, so I'm sure that's really easy.
There are many, so there are many people in the government that are reasonable, but there are many people in the government that take a completely different stance than you and I on performance parts.
Right.
And aftermarket sales and aftermarket industry. But that's what we're trying to do, is make our voice heard and help them understand. Sometimes I think they have the perception that there could be a boogeyman behind every tree. Mm-hmm. And we're trying to educate them and say, in fact, no, we want to be good stewards of the environment. We want to play by the rules that you're setting, but we also have to make sure that those rules are reasonable and that we can actually adhere to them in a reasonable manner, right? So that's kind of how we look at it.
Well, I also could see them being a little frustrated. Like, imagine you live in a nice, quiet neighborhood and a 370Z with a boom tune just goes right by you. I mean, I'd be like, all right, I hate all cars, make them all EV at that point, So I get the frustration there sometimes.
Yeah. But they're not going anywhere. Look at all of the regulation they've already put on us. I mean, we were talking about this last night, and like even with the boot on the neck, like things have gotten faster. Things have gotten, it's as they force us to go a certain route, things tend to get more efficient, and then we find power in places that we didn't know we had.
So that, to me, that's one of the coolest things about our industry is no matter what regulatory compliance, no matter what sort of rules and regulations they throw at us, our industry is so resilient. They find a way, right? And that, to me, that's one of the coolest parts about that industry. And you guys have seen it, the people with the bloody knuckles and the people with the sweat on their forehead that are making these parts, that are doing the hard work, that are taking on those challenges and going, you know what? I can actually look at this as an opportunity where I can do this better than anybody. You know? And so what comes out of some of that regulation and compliance also provides a huge opportunity for folks to do really interesting and cool stuff in the industry too.
Yeah, I think we could all still be running around with small blocks and carburetors if that had not happened, I guess.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you think about just where, even in the last, 15, 20 years, we came from vehicles that had batch fire fuel injection, right? Or as I affectionately call them, electroarburators, to the point now where we're doing, direct injection turbocharged engines that, have a specific output that far exceeds anything that you could even imagine or dream back then. I mean,
so
stuff
crazy.
That's far beyond even what the racing teams were doing back then. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I highly urge people to look at our episode with Nostrum Energy or Nostrum High Performance, because we were talking a lot about direct injectors on that one. So that's really cool. Of all the things that you guys provide members with here, so you have emissions testing, you have I want to say ASDA. It's not ASDA. It's
ADAS.
ADAS. There we go. ASDA. That's like the Walmart of the UK, I think. So you got ADAS, you got emissions, and a variety of other things. Of all of those, of course, they're all important in their own right. But which ones are getting regulated the hardest right now, or which ones are you paying attention to the most at the moment? I'm sure all of them, but is there any of them that's just kind of on the radar?
So the emissions thing is, I think, a little bit, we're kind of over the hill a bit with that now. We kind of understand how to deal with it. We understand what compliance looks like. We have a path to go do it. And there will be some changes, but for the most part, I think we understand them and we can deal with that as an industry. But as you mentioned ADAS, I think ADAS is kind of the new mountain we're looking at climbing. And the reason I say that is that that's going to start to be more and more regulated over time and will continue to be. And so we're really looking to the future of that. And from what we've learned with emissions, we're trying to be more proactive on the ADAS side of things. And for those of you who don't know, ADAS being advanced driver assistance systems is things like 360 surround view, things like lane keep assist, things like blind spot detection, all those things that help you basically keep the occupants of the vehicle more safe on the roadways. But when you think about it, how it impacts the aftermarket industry is, okay, now you've got this vehicle that performs out of the OEs with a known set of parameters. Now you want to change those parameters for whatever reason. Maybe you wanted to lower your Mustang. Maybe you want to, lift your Silverado. Maybe you want to, put a different set of wheels and tires on your Ram or your Jeep or whatever, right? That it can impact how that ADAS system functions. And right now, there are a couple of ADAS systems that are required in the U.S. Maybe you knew or you didn't know, but backup camera is one that is required in the United States. Every vehicle that's sold now has to have a backup camera. That's an ADAS system. Yep. Huh. The next one that's coming that we see is what's called FMVSS 126, which another acronym. We love our acronyms in engineering, don't we? So NHTSA, the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration, puts out rules through the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard, or FMVSS. And the latest one is FMVSS 127. FMVSS 127 governs automatic and pedestrian automatic emergency braking. So as we move forward in the aftermarket industry, we will have to abide by that basically in the 2030 timeframe, as that then even in the aftermarket industry, the products that you sell will have to be compliant to that. So, and you'll have to prove that. So kind of like emissions today, you have to prove it with an emissions test. You'll have to prove dynamically that the vehicle operates in a manner for automatic emergency braking and that. So I see that, to answer your question directly, the ADAS technologies and those coming Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards as our next challenge in the industry. that we'll need to find creative solutions to overcome.
We'll get back to the show in a second, but if you or your shop is building a car this winter, you might need components for an exhaust, an intake, charge piping, and who knows what else, because builds never end. If you need mandrel bends, flex couplers, T-clamps, and more, make Hayes Performance your first stop so you're not sitting around waiting on your stainless steel goodies. Check out everything they have to offer at hayesperf.com and use code Monoxide for free shipping as well. Let's get back to the show. That automatic front brake assist is challenging when you're trying to cut up traffic, just to say the least, from not a personal perspective. So that's probably the most upcoming one. What are some other ones that are to like kind of consider? Because like, for example, there's like the rear collision warnings and all that. Like, is there any kind of technologies that will probably be more prevalent, or it's just not even on the radar at the moment?
So we do have guidelines from the government, and that they're the guidelines kind of test the waters to see what's technically capable, and then they start to set laws based on what's technically capable. So there are many things like, eventually I see that they will govern lane keep assist. Eventually I see that they will govern blind spot detection. All the other things that, those ADAS systems, they will eventually say, okay, now there's a NHTSA standard for that. Mm-hmm. And that will be through an FMVSS. What the timeline is for that, I can't say that I know that. In fact, I don't think anyone knows that. But, part of the bills going through Washington right now, we actually oversee with our government affairs department, and we actually provide comments back to them and try to give them feedback on those pending regulations. So that's part of what we do here at the SEMA Garage as well, is we actually we help work with our legal team and government affairs to read those laws and make sure that they're reasonable, so that we can we have a chance and can hit them in the future, as they become law.
So let's talk about, like, let's use a front brake assist as an example. How can that affect somebody who's trying to lift a truck, that industry? Like, are you guys trying to essentially kind of provide a template, like, hey, here's how you would modify this system or however in order to make sure that the system works in a lifted truck? Mm-hmm. Is that a good way of asking that question?
Yeah, that's fair, and that makes sense. So exactly that. Meaning, when you look at a truck that's been lifted, we want to try to coach the aftermarket industry into, number one, knowing that they need to consider the ADAS stuff when they're designing these parts and thinking about these parts. So one is education, right, and understanding those systems and what is on the vehicles and how it could impact it. But then, in addition to that, so how do they then go about, if they know it, how do they then go about developing a product that will work with that system, right? So the next step is really kind of developing a set of best practices or standards or understanding around those systems to say, okay, we know that we can, I guess I typically explain it in a way where there's kind of a green box, a yellow box, and a red box.
Okay.
So I'm a very simple person, so I have to think in very simple pictures. So the green box is what the OEs know. They've tested for that. It may be different trim levels, it may be different tire sizes, it may be different trim, ride heights. Those sorts of things are in the green box, right? What we want to do in the aftermarket is what I call the yellow box, which is basically a little bit different than what the OEMs know, but still within the guidelines and standards that still work within the technology that is on the vehicle. So that's kind of the yellow box. That's where we want to play, right? That's the 35-inch tire with a 6-inch lift on an F-150, right? And then there's the red box. And the red box is, if you want to do 45-inch tires and, a 40-inch lift, the ADAS system is never going to be able to get there, in terms of being able to understand what's going on, and that's well outside of the scope of that. So what we're really trying to do is work in that yellow box and take as much information from the OEMs that we can and disseminate that to our membership so that they can understand it. We've written several white papers to give them data on that. So on the Silverado, on the F-150, on the Bronco, on a Tacoma, and a Ram, and those should all hopefully be, at least most of them, completed by the SEMA show. And our members will be able to download those and take a look at that data and at least help educate them to say exactly what you were saying on the front, on the forward collision warning and the automatic emergency braking. if I, at least directionally, if I understand if it will work or even come close to working on these trucks.
So let's say me, Mr. Consumer, I don't care. I'd prefer to never see that system in my car or vehicle whatsoever. How does that make it a problem for the aftermarket in general, right? Because, like, for example, like, we've had people on the show before that were part of R&D for, companies that do a ton of, like, aftermarket exhausts or whatever, and they have to put off-road use only. And most of the time they do stay off-road, but what happens when you start breaking the rules and now you're going onto the streets with this off-road use only product? Can that also become an issue? Like, let's say, you know what, I don't care about my front brake system. How does that affect you guys and how you are trying to play in that yellow box and now it's actually a red box?
Yeah, good question. That's something that we're going to have to monitor closely. And the SEMA member companies and other companies who are developing, the products for this space they'll have to understand it. Because as it becomes law, there isn't a way around it. So if you take it out of compliance, it's similar to kind of emissions now. If you take your car out of compliance, technically you could be liable for a big fine, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And
the company, right? Not the individual. Or maybe both.
Well, right now, both.
Yeah.
Like, if you have a truck lifted over a certain height, you're in trouble, and there's a lot of them out there that aren't.
And actually, SEMA just worked in the state of Georgia to change a law that was on the books, that was kind of a long-standing law that talked about how high you could move the frame over stock, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was kind of an ambiguous law, and it was kind of so we actually worked to help change that law in Georgia to make it better for our members to be able to sell those parts without fear of blowback from the regulatory agencies. So we work in ways to do that for sure, but we really want to help our members understand that and work toward compliance, right? Our members really want to keep the occupants of the vehicle safe. If that system isn't working as it should or as designed, then and we step over from the yellow box into the red box, that's a problem, right? I mean, you're signing yourself up for some liability, especially in the case where it's a regulated thing from NHTSA via an FMVSS. We're doing that today in terms of rollover. If you guys have heard of FMVSS 126, that was a rollover, sort of thing. So when you change the center of gravity of a vehicle, you have to make sure that the vehicle is still capable to do this FMVSS 126 test. So and pass that, right?
Right.
So we're doing that today, and the market is moving toward compliance today. Now, are there still people out there that are developing products that don't test for FMVSS that does affect the center of gravity of a vehicle? I'm sure there are.
Yeah.
But for the majority of our membership, though, they want to be good citizens, they want to do the right thing, and they want to be compliant. And really, at the end of the day, the winner is the consumer, right? Because then we end up developing products that are safer, they still get their modification that they want, and they know that their vehicle systems for ADAS are going to work properly.
It's like, so I'm gonna use an analogy here, and you can tell me if I'm right here. It's like we're the hostages, you're the hostage negotiator, and the government's the police, right? And maybe I guess I don't know where the OE or the aftermarket falls into that. But
This is your analogy. I'm not helping you.
I totally screwed it up. But you guys are there to work between the aftermarket and the government to make sure. And they're the people that land in your red box. It's kind of an at your own risk situation at that point, I suppose.
That's right. Yeah, and of course, we would never coach anyone into that red box, right?
Right,
We're trying
absolutely.
to coach people. Honestly, we're trying to coach people out of the red box into the yellow box, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's what we're really trying to do. And I mean, your analogy is close, right?
Yeah,
We're definitely a go-between. I don't know if you call us a hostage negotiator or what.
It sounded really good in my head.
Fair
before
enough. Fair enough. Maybe we're the hostage negotiator.
Yep.
But also we want to be the go-between with the OEMs as well to try to get it on their radar to say, hey, start thinking about the aftermarket or keep thinking about the aftermarket when you develop vehicles, because we know that in the aftermarket we're going to be modifying those vehicles. So if you think about us ahead of time, what sells? So we have some kind of old data now, but data that says that many of the people in our industry purchase vehicles based on the fact as to how they can modify them after the fact.
Yes.
So what we're trying to coach the OEs into is saying, hey, if you want to sell more pickup trucks than the other guy, think about the aftermarket, because trucks are some of the most highly modified vehicles on the planet. In fact, I gave you the statistic, but roughly 75, 80% of our market is really around truck parts and accessories in the aftermarket. So it's a huge chunk of it, right?
Yep.
So as an OE, think about that when you develop this truck, right? When you make the wheel well and you do your tire flop, think about a 35-inch tire that might go on this truck, or a 37 or a 40, right? Make it capable of that so that the aftermarket can do that after the fact, because they're still going to go do it. So thinking about those ADAS systems, to circle back to that, is think about the adaptability of that, or giving the industry the information to be able to make changes to that system so that that system will work together with those components rather than against it.
Yeah, that was going to be my next point. Let's pretend you sell a Silverado and it can't be lifted at all because it interferes with the system, but the F-150 can. I guarantee you, there's a big sway in who buys F-150s versus Silverados.
Yeah, no, you're spot on with that, and that's what we're trying to be the hostage negotiator between the OEM and the aftermarket. Also, is to try to help.
We'll get this analogy fine tuned.
I like it.
We'll get there.
I think we can tune it up.
Yeah.
That'll be your new name tag. Automotive hostage negotiator. AHN. Don't worry about it. We'll figure out an acronym.
All right.
We'll workshop it. So you're saying of that, let's say, did you find a correlation between, like, let's say that 330 or 380 billion a year? Would you say that the 80% being trucks also kind of counts for that, or maybe not as much? Or is that just kind of woo-woo math?
Yeah, I think, I'm not sure there's a direct correlation there, but let's just say it carries a lot of the water. Now, the 53 billion that we talked about as far as part sales, that basically would represent that 70 some odd percent of that would be roughly what you'd be looking at for parts for trucks, aftermarket parts for trucks.
So what's that catalog look like? What are those, like, 3 or 4 whatever main sellers when it comes to the truck aftermarket?
Ooh, boy,
leveling kits.
I'm sure. So wheels and tires are always a big hitter, right? I mean, so that's, if we have an entire study, if you're a SEMA member, that you can download for free, that is basically the state of the industry. We have a gentleman named Gavin Knapp who sits in California. That's his responsibility for the year, is to produce that report. So Gavin would be the best guy to answer that question. I apologize, I don't know it off the top of my head, but wheels and tires has to be right up there leading the league. But you think about truck toppers and caps and mud flaps and performance exhausts and seat covers and cup holders and wind deflectors and bug shields and paint protection film and ceramic coatings and I mean, the list goes on, right?
Well, I didn't hear fuzzy steering wheel in there, which kind of disappoints me.
You also, I'm quite partial to the Yosemite Sam mud flaps myself, but there's lots of I mean, the sky's the limit on what you can do to accessorize your truck, and people do.
Mm-hmm. I love how you said sky's the limit. 40-inch lifts.
I can't think of any truck I've ever owned that I haven't modified in any way, shape, or form. Usually 11 kit and bigger tires. Yeah. Number one. Yeah.
Yeah, and you're spot on with that. And in the ADAS testing that we've done, we've specifically designed it to hit some of those very common categories to get the data out there to say, at least directionally, maybe it doesn't work on every truck and trim level, but on these kind of category of parts, that at least you have a shot, right? It looks like it's something that could be workable. And a leveling kit and a larger tire is a huge one, right? For pickup trucks, for sure.
Well,
but
I feel
on a
like
Mustang, typically people aren't lifting Mustangs, right?
Sometimes people do, but yeah.
Yeah, there are those out there, and I've seen them. But a lowering kit may be the thing, right?
Yeah.
But if you think about it, how could a vehicle wrap that maybe has a metallic liner on it actually impact how that ADAS system functions, So think about those sorts of things too. Maybe it's not just something that affects the pitch, roll, and yaw of how the vehicle sits statically, but maybe it's something that you're putting on. If you put your Hoonigan banner over the forward vision camera, on your Subaru.
Oh, I didn't even think about that. Yeah.
That's going to impact how that ADAS system can function. So the sky's the limit. I've heard stories about how you put a bike rack on the back of a vehicle, and now you can't back out of your garage because it thinks it's something behind you, and it grabs the brakes and it says, no, you're not going to move because I don't want to hit something. So then you have to take your bike rack off and back out of the garage and then reinstall it, right? So all those things are things that we're trying to coach people into thinking about when they're developing those products, and then being able to make designs that it'll work.
I would like to give a shout out to the ADAS systems for failing my first driving test, by the way. The auto brake kicked in as I was doing the parallel park, and I had plenty of space, but it's like, oh no, you're too close. And that was the last point that caused me to fail the test in my mom's Jeep way back when. Why are you here, right? Because you obviously have a long career, having been at GM and Bosch. Why did this call your name? Or why were you called upon?
Yeah, well, so the areas of expertise that I had coming out of the various OEMs and the various aftermarket performance suppliers that I worked at lined up pretty well with the experience that I needed to set up the facility, identify the people that we had, and identify the challenges in the industry. So with my emissions experience at Honda, with my performance experience in both the motorsport industry and the aftermarket tuning industry, and then also at the OEM again at Chevrolet, actually developing performance parts at an OEM, really helped kind of set the stage well for me to come here. But to come to SEMA, I love the aftermarket industry. I want to see it survive and grow strong. I have a 16-year-old daughter who is nuts about motorsports, and I love that. And I want to make sure that and my son is 11, and he loves everything with wheels. And I want to make sure that industry is strong for the long term, so that generations from now, they can still be doing the same things that we are, modifying vehicles, enjoying going to a racetrack, through our the performance racing industry that also falls under the SEMA umbrella, and do those things and enjoy that, and enjoy, the automotive hobby and the aftermarket industry as a hobby for the long term. So I want to try to set that up for generations to come, and that's what really drew me here. Is I think I can have a big impact on that and help that development and steer that both at a government level, but also with our members directly.
Are you guys doing the basically the same thing over at the California facility too? Is it you just two different locations, so it's easier for your members?
Yes, that's exactly right. So
Okay.
we started out in California. That was our first location, actually. That was about almost 10 years ago now that they set that up. And our former CEO, Chris Kirsting, was actually with some others on the SEMA board, kind of had this idea. And they said, hey, we're facing a lot of challenges in the aftermarket in these specific areas. Could SEMA help with that? And so as SEMA set up that garage, they said, so what are some of the challenges? So emissions was one. It's very expensive to set up an emissions lab. Roughly here in Detroit, it was definitely a 7-figure project, almost an 8-figure project, right, to set up an emissions lab. So that's not something typically your everyday SEMA member can do.
No.
Right?
Well, that's
So-
a OE level kind of deal too, right?
Yeah, and it is. Yeah, it's definitely a high level facility that not only you cut a big check to just set it up, but you also have to cut a big check to get the people in who understand how to run that equipment and keep it functioning, and make sure that we can work with the government agencies and they trust the information coming out of it. So to me, that's a big part of SEMA and a big part of that garage was a big hurdle that we had at the time. We were getting, members who were being, who had compliance regulations put against them, who had fines and things like that. We wanted to set up a path to go do that, right? Another part was our development department. So the 3D printer is in the background of the cameras here, but at the time, 3D printing was a pretty novel idea. Not everybody had a 3D printer. Now it's a little more of a commoditized item, but we still offer 3D printing, for our membership that didn't have access. The scanner that we have behind us, behind the F-150 in the background, that's a $120,000 scanner, right? Not everybody has $120,000 to go out and get this scan equipment, but through the tech transfer program, we offer the access to those scans so that you can go develop products on your CAD machine to be able to develop those products. So that garage was really set up to be able to address the big and expensive challenges in that product development in that cycle. And so we learned from that, and I guess I say we kind of we're standing on the shoulders of giants here in Detroit with this garage, understanding the challenges that were then, and now we we also are addressing those challenges here in a different geographical location for a couple reasons. One is we want to be in the OE's backyard and have a strong relationship with them, because we know as automotive technology continues to increase and improve that we need the OEMs to work with us on those vehicles and to be able to be successful in the aftermarket. The other thing is just geographically, if you're in New York, a SEMA member in New York, Diamond Bar, California is a good ways away, right?
Yeah.
Right.
But geographically, it's much easier to get to Detroit from Florida or New York or wherever. So it also creates a geographical advantage as well. The other thing that we were finding is that our programs were so full in California that our members were having to wait a long time in line. So we wanted to alleviate that problem by increasing our capacity in these different departments, and that's another thing that we accomplished here in our Detroit facility.
What's it look like, or at what point do I decide I need to become a member? I'm a guy, I work at a shop, I'm a fabricator, I have a home shop, I make X pipes for a certain car, and I sell so many a month or something, but I make them at home in my shop. Is there a level at which somebody in that situation can become part of your program and it's affordable for somebody like that, or? Yeah,
absolutely. And there's so many, it's kind of like the Amex commercial, but there's so many benefits to membership. Mm-hmm. And it's scaled towards actually the revenue that folks bring in. So if you're, in fact, so we have people that are a guy in a garage fabricating X pipes can be a SEMA member at a very reasonable cost, a few $100s a year, all the way up through General Motors and Ford and Nissan and Honda that are also SEMA members, by the way, that have obviously orders of magnitude larger revenue.
Right.
And their member dues are higher, but even that, they're still what I consider to be fairly reasonable. So it is scaled toward what you're looking at. So anyone who has, looks at those benefits, it's easy to find a benefit that the membership pays for itself almost immediately. I mean, and one of them is, I say, getting into the garage here, right? Using the installation center, using the training center, having access to people in the compliance department, having access to talk to government affairs, being able to get, if you want a booth, a 10 by 10 booth at the SEMA show, what you would pay for the SEMA membership, you probably get more in a discount at the booth at the show than what it costs you for the membership. So there are a ton of different membership advantages to being able to do that, and it's scalable for whatever size business that you have.
Okay.
Now, as we sort of kind of run out of time here, let's talk a little bit about emissions. Again, you guys have a very expensive emissions system or testing system over here. What are some of the more complex processes? Because like you said, there's a range of things that you would measure when it comes to emissions. What are some of the more complex ones? What do those look like?
So probably the more complex emissions projects are something. The diesel vehicles are probably the ones that are the most intensive as far as the testing goes, and that's for a couple reasons. So one, we all know the Volkswagen Dieselgate scandal, right, that happened.
Yeah.
So,
why you got to call me out like that?
Yeah. So that was one of the ones that they really had their eye on the industry, right? And so they're highly scrutinizing that because of what happened with that whole situation. But the diesels are notorious for a couple reasons. So one, when we actually do a SEMA certified program, which is actually a program that we set up here at the SEMA Garage, that allows folks to do the emissions testing and then sell it in 49 states outside of California. And then if they want, they can go on and get a CARB executive order, which allows it in all 50 states. But the testing that's required is basically the same to do that. But there's two parts that we actually have to kind of oversee or turn in and check when we're doing those. One of them is an OBD monitor, emissions monitor, and all those OBD and emissions monitors have to have set, checked, and passed prior to us doing an emissions test. On a diesel vehicle, in many cases, that means we need to go through 3 diesel particulate filter regen cycles before it will actually set, check, and say, okay, yes, all that stuff is working as designed, and we're good to go. So that could be, 750 miles, 1,500 miles, 2,500 miles that you have to put on the vehicle to be able to do that. So think about how long it would take you to drive 750 miles, even at a minimum, right? So that's a lot of time, that's a lot of effort, that's a lot of expense for members to do that. So that's one part of it. Then the second part of it is actually going in and actually testing the emissions portion of it, right? So, and there are several components to emissions. So some of it is gaseous emissions and the other is particulate emissions, both of which are regulated. So then you have to go in and actually measure the gaseous emissions, and then you also have to check and make sure that the particulate emissions, and if either of those fails, then you kind of have to go back to the drawing board and make some changes, either in the hardware design or maybe the tune or whatever, to get back into the regulatory compliance that is set out there. So long story long, the diesels are definitely one of the more drawn out and expensive emissions tests that we do because of those very reasons. And one of the other things I guess I'll point out is we don't get to just run BP diesel fuel in our lab. The government specifies what diesel fuel we have to run. It's a certified fuel that's been tested. We know exactly what's in it, the heating values and all the different constituents of it, but it runs about $50 a gallon.
No Ivy League for your kids this year because Tuned by Sean is having a massive Black Friday sale on a mountain of Haltech products. If you want your build ready for the 2025 season, send your little prodigy to community college and take advantage of the 5 to 20% off deals on all types of Haltech goodies. Go to tunedbysean.com and check out what it'll take to get your build on the road for the next car season. Let's get back to the show.
So when you're doing that testing and you have to put 8 gallons of diesel fuel in the truck to make it through the testing at $50 a gallon, you're looking at just that fuel for the emissions portion, you're looking at a pretty big bill. So
you don't have to, you just have to run that for testing. You don't have to run that to get your regen cycles and all that stuff then, do you?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Fortunately.
Yeah, right.
You can if you want.
Yeah.
If you're looking to burn a stack of cash, we would be happy to run it through the vehicle for you. But yeah, we fortunately for the OBD stuff, we can run pump fuel.
Okay. So then when you hand it, let's say we have a fail situation, right? You hand back, I'm assuming, a ton of data back to your member, right? I mean,
Yes.
And they can kind of go from there on what they think they can or can't adjust, I suppose.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, and we have a couple ways that we can actually do that. If the vehicle does fail, which does happen, it's not an easy, if people think they just come in here and it's easy and they just throw parts at it and it's just going to pass, I think
Right.
unfortunately you're mistaken, number one. And it does take an understanding of calibration parameters and understanding what you can and can't change. Again, best practices on an air intake or something to make sure that the airflow that the mass airflow sensor is seeing is the airflow that the engine is getting, and making sure that that's right. But those emissions tests are not easy. But there are several things that we can do to help coach that. We can show them. I showed you earlier when we took the tour about the bags, right? We can kind of narrow it down and focus on which part of the emissions cycle maybe most impacted that result, and we can kind of focus on that and help that. In addition to that, we can also run what's called a modal test, which actually, instead of kind of sampling a period of time, it samples the actual emission constituent at that exact time. So we can actually show you in that where you may have spiked up, and you can then look in and say, okay, so what happened in this scenario to make that spike? So we can kind of help drill in with the member to be able to kind of narrow it down, and then maybe they can understand what's going on and make the appropriate changes to pass.
Okay.
So can you explain what some different emission cycles would be tested in that instance? Like what are the varieties of it?
Yeah, so we have one that's referred to as an FTP 75. It's Federal Test Procedure 75. If my memory serves, it was actually came out with in 1975, but or at least thereabouts. But that test is actually a test where we roll the vehicle onto the emissions dyno, and we actually have to do a cold start test. So basically, what it's trying to identify is to see how the vehicle performs when the catalytic converter isn't lit off, and then when it gets up to temperature, and then how it performs once it's lit off and you do actually a hot restart. So that's an FTP 75. Then we do what's called a highway fuel economy test, and that's actually more of, and The FTP 75 is more what I would consider to be like a city drive. So there's a lot of stops and starts, kind of what you would expect during your commute in the morning in a city. The highway fuel economy is more exactly what it says on the tin, right? Is more out, you're cruising around. Maybe it's, you're on a 2-lane road doing 50 miles an hour or something like that. And that's one of the other tests that we run. There's also one called a USO6, which is actually a more severe test. That one actually gets up to around 80 miles an hour, and it's actually got some fairly severe accelerations in it. So that's kind of evaluating more of what I would consider to be like a 2/3 load, or maybe 3/4, or
like a spirited drive.
Yeah, spirited drive is a good way to put it.
Or late to work.
Yeah, late to work drive. And then there's also one that encompasses more how the air conditioning impacts when that turns on, how that could impact emissions. So that's called an SCO3. So that's another test that we can do. So if you have to run the full gambit, that's typically the 4 tests that we would run to do that. And the SCO3 is kind of a more moderate drive, but in that one, we actually have to run the air conditioning full blast for the whole test and see how that could potentially impact the emissions. So they all kind of focus on different portions of that drive cycle, but if you step out of line on any one of those, it can cause you to fail.
Okay.
How does air conditioning affect it, by the way? Like, is it like, how drastic of a change can it be if air conditioning's on?
It's probably a lot better now than it used to be, but
yeah. So it's essentially your the air conditioning compressor on the vehicle can actually impact the load. So you think about when you're idling, and maybe you've even seen it or heard it kick on in a vehicle where the air conditioning pump kicks on and the engine either change tone or even drops in RPM a little bit, right?
Yeah, fair enough.
So it's talking about putting load on the engine maybe and loading it up a little bit more where maybe it wasn't in some of the other tests, right? And even on the freeway when it's kicking on and kicking off, does that create some sort of dynamic that may cause the emissions to change in a certain way? So the full test for SCO3 actually also has a big rack of lights and a huge fan, and that's how the OEs have to test it. But it's just looking at all the sorts of different things and we do all our testing, by the way, at room temperature here. The OEs have to actually go in and they do testing down at 20 degrees Fahrenheit. They do testing at high altitude. They do testing at high temperature. So they definitely, it's a heavy lift to get all those to pass, for that sort of stuff.
So when you hear, OEs having to spend $1 billion or whatever on development, that's why, because if they're trying to kick out a vehicle in a timely fashion, they have to have 10, 20, or 100 test mules, all to prove stuff just for emissions.
That's right. Well, and then you think about the mileage accumulation. They have to guarantee those emissions over 150,000 miles now. So now you're testing what do the emissions look like at 4,000 miles? What do they look like at 50,000 miles? What do they look like at 100,000 miles? And what do they look at 150,000 miles? So that diesel truck behind you, by the way, has to pass emissions. If that guy drove at 100,000 miles with a 30-foot, 40-foot gooseneck behind it, right? It still has to pass emissions at 100,000 miles. So you have to think about all the different duty cycles like you were talking about. That's why they spend billions with a B on this development. And it's a big deal because, the emissions regulations are from the government. And if they don't pass those, because they do in-use testing after the fact where they'll pull vehicles in off the road and then they'll test them and make sure that in real life scenarios, they actually still are passing those emissions. So it's it kind of caves your head in a little bit when you think about all the different scenarios and all the different possibilities, all the different drive cycles. You think about it and you're like, oh, I drive really hard. I'd probably be the worst case scenario. Well, sometimes grandpa who fires up his truck once a day to go get the mail and then the vehicle never gets warm and he parks it in his garage, that vehicle actually may be the worst case scenario for those sorts of emissions versus somebody who goes out on a spirited drive on occasion and actually gets the vehicle warm and starts to burn some of those constituents out. So it's when you start to think about it, it definitely is a big puzzle.
Well, especially if we're talking like DI stuff we were talking about yesterday.
Well, the biggest thing is regen on a diesel, right? I just pulled for my kids' soccer. I pulled a diesel tractor with a hay wagon on it all day long for the thing, and it wanted to regen, and I had to put the throttle up a little bit in order for it to regenerate. So I'm like, hold on, here we go.
Yep.
And but don't worry, it'll probably have to go through 3 or 4 DPFs before it hits 150,000 miles.
Yeah, it's amazing to think about how they have to make those parts perform on I mean, what is a GM? They kick out almost 1 million Silverados and Sierras a year, and you think about how many combinations of parts, and think about how many miles those have to cover, and think about having to make sure that they're able to, meet emissions in all those different scenarios. It's nuts. And like you said, with all the different operating modes that it can get into, it's just it's amazing. I mean, it's a small miracle it works at all.
And that's why you have thousands and thousands of employees and hundreds of engineers and such. So
Yep.
that's just crazy.
I got one more.
Yeah, one more, and then we can do the pick 3.
Yeah. Okay. So obviously we're here. It's kind of quiet. We're at the end of the week, but what does staff look like around here? So kind of a 2-part question. What does staff look like around here, and how often are your aftermarket members using the shop versus asking you to do the part on and off testing stuff for them?
Yeah, good question. So what it looks like around here on a daily basis is we have basically 10 employees. So 3 of those work in our actually actively doing the emissions testing and the mileage accumulation and the things that we talked about, with that. We have a development engineer that his primary responsibility is scanning, working with the CAD data, working with the folks in tech transfer, and doing the 3D printing. Then we also have an ADAS expert, that is working on scheduling the ADAS testing, developing educational programs to help educate our membership, also reading 238-page infrastructure bills to see what sort of FMVSS regulations are coming down the line and what sort of guidelines we need to make comments on. So, and then we also have 3 or 4 compliance folks that actually work to process the paperwork, understand what the members are trying to test, get the paperwork around, make sure that we schedule it in the lab correctly, get the report out of the lab correctly, turn in the paperwork to CARB, and get the SEMA certified and CARB executive orders for the membership. So it's a busy place for sure, most days. And, that's kind of what it looks like.
You have some mechanics here then too that are doing it, or are all these other people also doing that?
So we do have a mechanic. Yep. Sorry. And he kind of falls under the emissions portion, but
okay.
They may be working on changing a turbocharger. They may be working on changing a catalytic converter. They may be putting an air intake on a car. They may be flashing a tune to a vehicle that we want to go in and test the tune. So, there's lots of different stuff. So yes, there's a lot of work that goes on in this room in particular, doing those modifications. But a week ago we had 100 people from one SEMA member that were doing a sales training upstairs in our training room that you guys saw. And then they came down and they actually walked around vehicles and did an ideation session on what parts can we do with this new vehicle? How should we roll them out? What makes sense to tackle first? What are some of the challenges that we see? Maybe it's ADAS, maybe it's emissions, maybe it's just physical fitment and how you manufacture something. So lots of activity here, and probably one of the most used parts of the most used part of the facility for sure is the emissions test lab that's in constant use. Probably followed by development. 3D scanning is really picking up, in the tech transfer program. And then I would say after that, it's members coming in and using the our training room upstairs, and then the install center is kind of the beating heart of the whole garage.
Okay.
Real quick one for me.
Yeah.
It's never ending, I promise. So for your emission stuff, let's say you have a car running on the dyno for however long, what's the most mileage you've put on a car in one go? Anything come to mind?
Yeah, well, it's definitely a diesel.
Okay.
And we have run it for several hundred miles on the dyno to get it to do a regen cycle, because
that's just one go.
That's just one go. So driving a cycle or setting the cruise control and waiting for it to finish its DPF regen. Because if we get in the middle of an emissions test and it needs to do a regen, we have to get through that, because that regen cycle is something that can mess up those test results, right? So we have to kind of monitor let's say the capacity of the DPF. And then we have to, if it gets up to 80, 90%, it's better for us to go ahead and do that regen cycle and then test on the back side of that. So that could be a several 100-mile drive to get it to go through that.
And I know you're not a diesel guy, so just a real quick regen is when the diesel particulate filter hits a certain spot, it needs to regenerate. So a lot of times, sometimes they'll even inject diesel into the deal to heat it up to, what is it, like 1,200 degrees or something, to burn off and clean out the filter.
Yes, it's exactly that. It's basically taking that soot that you might ordinarily see out the tailpipe and basically just blowing a flamethrower in there to burn it. You know, and that's what the regen does.
You
in
can
a DPF.
smell it. You can hear it sometimes. It's a lot of fun.
And it gets super hot.
Yeah.
That's why, if you're wondering why you see the weird tip designs on a diesel, it's to try to get the temperature down out the tailpipe so that you don't burn your leg or you don't catch the wheat field on fire, you know, those sorts of stuff. So
Let it rip, Dan.
All right. So we know we got to be sensitive of your time. This has been great. We really enjoyed it.
We'll be back.
But yes, absolutely. At the end of every episode, we like to ask our guests to pick 3 cars. You have to pick a track car, a daily driver, and a show car. You have an unlimited budget. You pick whatever you want, swap whatever you want. What are you picking?
wow, boy, that's a good one. So track car.
Yep.
I think I would probably have to go with C8 Z06. You know,
okay.
I mean, flat plane crank goodness, right? I mean, that's cool. I think that would probably have to be what I go with a track car. I mean, unbelievably capable, way more talented than I am. So, you know, but I love the look of the car and I love the performance of the car. And 5.5 liters of V8 flat plane crank. How could you go wrong?
Right. Yep.
So,
daily driver and show car.
oh, daily driver. I'm a bit of a weirdo when it comes to
You'd be surprised
cars.
with some of the answers we had, but go ahead, shoot.
So, daily driver, I've been looking for a Volvo 850R. I've always loved wagons. And the 5-cylinder noise is one of my favorite noises on earth. In fact, I could probably, right behind that 1A would be an RS3. I mean, that would be cool too with the 5-cylinder. So I'd say probably one of those. But the 850R,
you gotta choose one though.
Love the brick. I gotta love the brick.
I do like those Volvos for some reason.
So which one are you choosing? 850 or the RS3?
The brick.
Okay.
I'd say the 850R.
We're locking that in.
Yeah.
And show car.
Show car, yep.
Oh, wow. Show car. Man, I got to say, I do have an affinity for the square body stuff. So, but I like a little bit. I like a little bit of kind of a weird, like a modification to it. Is I think the ones that have been repowered with like either a Cummins or a Duramax, you know, are pretty cool. And there's actually one that my emissions lab manager has that I'm quite fond of. It's got a nice patina on it. It's a dually, and it's been converted to with a Duramax diesel in it. So, and it's been lowered. So,
oh, that's cool.
Yeah, it's got the 22-inch Alcoa wheels on it and stuff like that. So I would have to say something along those lines would be probably my show car.
All right, you have an unlimited budget, so just buy his.
Checks out. Well, perfect. On that note, well, thank you very much for coming on to the show. Is there anywhere you would want people to find you or reach out to you, or pretty low key? Or
yeah, so SEMAgarage.com. If there's anything that's tipped your fancy, you can find all that information there. You can find my contact information or find more about the programs and things that we offer here at the SEMA Garage at SEMAgarage.com. SEMA.org if you're interested in any of the membership things or anything like that. That's where I would say check that out. But really enjoyed having you guys. Come back anytime. We'll be happy to dig more.
Well, I'm going
holes.
to develop some sort of very small part just so I can become a member and just come hang out and use the garage.
I love it. Let's do it.
All right.
We'll have Jets Pizza. We'll develop parts. It'll be fun.
Perfect.
Dan.
You can find us at Gunna Garage with 2 N's.
And if you made it this far into the show, you know where you're at. Thank you very much for tuning in, guys. Ben, thank you for coming on. And Dan, thanks for existing. We'll see you all next time.